Good evening, everyone, and welcome, ma'am. I warmly welcome you all for the In Dialogue lecture series, and I thank you all for joining with us. I'm Azima Salim. I'm a volunteer with In Dialogue Foundation. Our guest for today's lecture is Professor Bindu Puri. She is a professor of contemporary Indian philosophy at the Center for Philosophy, School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi, India. She is currently the chairperson of the center. Her main interests in philosophy are in the area of contemporary Indian philosophy, moral and political philosophy. Professor Puri has been consistently engaged in a set of interrelated problems in contemporary Indian philosophy. She is a leading scholar on the thought and practices of Mahatma Gandhi and has worked on the philosophical issues involved in Gandhi's debate with Savarkar, Ambedkar, and Tagore. Thank you. Thanks a lot, ma'am, for accepting our invitation. I warmly welcome you for this In Dialogue lecture series. And the topic for today's discussion is Gandhi, Svabhavna, Ahimsa, and owning kinship with the different other. So the lecture will be for 45 minutes, followed by 30 minutes question and answer. And I'll request you all to keep typing your questions on the chat box so we can have the discussion after the lecture. Now I request you, ma'am, to please proceed with the lecture. Thank you.
And thank you so very much and for having me in dialogue. And very special thanks to Dr. Patni who has invited me here today. I'm also very fascinated by the ongoing lecture series, which he told me are on peace and coexistence.
Yes.
And this led me to choose a topic on to speak on Gandhi, which, as you know, is Swabhav Ahimsa and owning kinship with the different other. Though, of course, it's hard to say that Gandhi was interested in coexistence. In a certain sense, he went beyond coexistence because he said that you don't need to think of coexisting with others, but you need to honor those who are the most different and the most difficult for you to understand. And I'm going to unpack Gandhi's arguments as we go along the different sections of this lecture. But I'd also like to add one more thing that my Twitter handle is at the rate Professor Puri. If anybody would like to ask me a question later, they can send me a message across Twitter. Now, it's difficult to limit a discussion on the contemporary relevance of the Gandhian legacy to any one central point because so very many things that he said and did are terribly important to the times that we live. Look, for instance, at the idea of limiting your wants. The COVID-19 pandemic has taught us to do it so less. And Gandhi had spoken about this a long time ago that you need to embrace some kind of non-covetousness, non-possession, aparigraha, which by force we are doing now. So lots of Gandhi's ideas are relevant to our modern predicament. But if you are asked to talk about one central point, and I'm often asked to talk about one thing in Gandhi that you think is so terribly important, I would say it is ahimsa and Gandhi's ahimsanath response to the otherness of the different other, uh, which who is often frequently hostile to us, seems especially significant today, given that the contemporary world is both plural as well as conflict ridden. And it's possible to argue that Gandhi's ahimsa as a response to the otherness of the other is an alternative to both, to other ways of responding to conflict in our world. And particularly, one is either commonly a liberal, responding to difference with tolerance, coming from a skepticism about all truth claims, or one is simply non liberal, responding to different others with conflict and violence. So if somebody disagrees with you, you feel very conflict ridden. The contemporary relevance of Gandhi's alternative as ahimsa, and I'm going to use a term which I love in Gandhi, which is abhaidan, gift of fearlessness to others. Uh, Obviously, this is very relevant to us. Difference can be along many lines: gender, race, religion, ethnic origin, language, culture, but it almost always presents itself as an otherness that we need to overcome. Now, what about Gandhi? Gandhi himself was no stranger to conflict. He had dealt with three fairly significant self and other conflicts. with the racial, colonial, and religious others. It was perhaps in response to these conflicts that Gandhi had developed his own insights into the connection between truth and ahimsa, and he had thought out a proper, appropriate response to difference, and this was non-violence. And you can think about satyagraha as this practice of ahimsa in the interest of arriving at truth between two opposing positions. Having spelled out this, I need to sort of make an attempt to engage with ahimsa, and I'm going to do this across three sections. In the first section, I'm going to explore this idea in Gandhi. And, you know, often it's argued that Gandhi's ahimsa was much more than non-injury. And Gandhi conveyed what he understood by ahimsa by using a lot of terms, interrelated terms. And in this section, which I entitle Ahimsa, to own kinship with those most distant from oneself, I'm going to explore the terms that Gandhi had invoked in connection with ahimsa, you know, which I used in the title of my talk, Swabhav, which means Swa and Bhav, ownmost orientation. Kinship, you know, coming from the family, your kith and kin, love, compassion, and what I said, Abhaidan, the gift of fearlessness to all. And these are terms that Gandhi used very frequently in connection with ahimsa. And that's what I'm going to unpack in the first part of my lecture. The second part is on ahimsa and truth, and I want to bring out the close connection between truth and ahimsa in Gandhi. And the third one is entitled To Tolerate or to Honor, Liberalism and Gandhi. And here I'm going to try to bring out the difference between liberal idea of tolerating otherness and Gandhi's idea that you need to honor those who are different from yourself. Okay, so I'm moving on to the first section, and I'm going to begin with this. One of the most fascinating metaphors that Gandhi used in connection with ahimsa was the idea of owning kinship. And I'm going to, quote Gandhi over here from the collected works. And this is from 1926, two essays that he wrote in Young India. That of owning kinship with not merely the ape, but the horse and the sheep, the lion and the leopard, the snake and the scorpion. And in a set of these two interesting essays written in Young India in 1926 on the Swabhav, nature, ownmost orientation of man, Gandhi had explained that owning kinship with the most distant, different other was ahimsa, and that such ahimsa was man's Swabhav and his special virtue or khas lakshan. In this set of essays, Gandhi went on to write, quote, the difficult dharma which rules my life, and I hold, ought to rule that of every man and woman, impose this ek pakshi farj, unilateral obligation on us. And it is so imposed because only the human is the image. The word in Gujarati is pratibimb, silhouette of God. So quite clearly, Gandhi is using this idea of man's swabhav as owning kinship with the snake, scorpion, is a metaphor. And, there are these very many incidents of scorpions in the ashrams. And Gandhi was very scared of the scorpions. And this whole idea that you need to own kinship with not only the human, but the non-human. And this point over here is to draw attention to man's unilateral obligation qua man towards the otherness of the human and non-human other. And this is, the sense of farj is most easily thought of in the family. Because, in the family, you own kinship with the one who is most difficult to you. You have to own kinship. And Gandhi is here telling you that as a man, you have this unilateral obligation to own kinship with those who are most different from yourself. And this is really, this you find as early as 1909. I think the Hind Swaraj is a very important text if you want to understand Gandhi. There Gandhi talks about a thief entering the house. And he says, what should you do with this thief? What you should do is to treat him as your brother. And actually he goes on to say that I'll think this is my father, this is my brother, and I'm going to put everything very neatly so that he can take it away, very easily. So, this whole idea of owning kinship with that who is most distant from you. Then Gandhi talks about love in this connection. And he explains that the sort of love he's talking about is not really a romantic love. It's a different kind of love. It is a love of those who differ from you. And here I'm quoting Gandhi. This is one of my favorite quotations from Gandhi. It is no non-violence if we merely love those who love us. Everybody loves those who love us. It is non-violence only when we love those who hate us. And that's really a difficult thing to do. This Gandhian idea of loving those who differ from you and even loving those who hate oneself makes it apparent that Gandhi's use of love in connection with ahimsa is a kind of non-passionate love that transforms both the giver as well as the receiver. And you know, here many people refer to the Sermon on the Mount, and Gandhi also refers to Patanjali and to the Yoga Sutra, and he refers to this one particular sutra which says, hate dissolves in the power of love. Now, here Gandhi is tapping on the idea of love as a transforming force. Think about all the creative things you can do with love. So that's really what he's trying to do. So Gandhi's ahimsa is involving the practice of non-violence as a kind of unilateral obligation to love others without passion and to own kinship with them. Now, the idea is that you can understand this kind of love. You know, in the family, when you have a fight with a sibling or with a parent, you use this idea of love as transformative. And that's why he keeps talking about kinship in this connection. Now, another idea that he uses is that of daya or compassion. And you find this was an idea that he very strongly gets from the Jain tradition. The Jains are a fascinating people. They are, merchants, and Gandhi was very much guided by Raichand Bhai Mehta, whom he had met in 1891, who was a dealer of precious gems, and wonderful insights actually from Jain Dharma came to Gandhi from Raichand Bhai Mehta. And here there is this idea of compassion. And the second chapter in Raichand Bhai's book, which is called Mokshamala, which we know Gandhi read, was titled Sarvamanya Dharma, a religion accepted by all. And this called, identified the essence of religion as compassion. So I'll just give you one thought from Mata Nazgam, where she says, look, compassion is, you can be educated into feeling compassion. Compassion contains some thought. It contains three thoughts. The idea that someone is suffering, the idea that that suffering is undeserved, and the idea that we are vulnerable ourselves. Before I talk about, I just thought I'll give you these three thoughts. So, this is, for instance, what happens when we are in this pandemic over here. We feel a lot of compassion for the person who's suffering. Remember, there are these three thoughts going on in our head. Now, Raichand Bhai Mehta also talked about compassion, daya, in connection with ahimsa. And Gandhi also talks about it. And in Hind Swaraj, in chapter 17, Gandhi quotes the poet Tulsidas. And he says over here, the force of compassion, that is the force of love, that is satyagraha. So you practice compassion when you feel somebody is far away from the truth, instead of hitting and forcing them, you practice satyagraha, whereby you practice pain, you actually practice penance, tapasya on yourself. You take a voluntary suffering to convince others. So in a sense, this is compassion for the other. You don't want the other to suffer. You want to suffer yourself in the search for truth. Now, Raichand Bhai had argued that compassion can be practiced best through Abhaidan, or the gift of fearlessness to all life. And this gift of fearlessness is realized only through taking a vow of non-violence. Now, here we are getting a little dense because I'm a philosopher and I have to philosophically unpack Gandhi. So this Abhaidan for me is a very, very beautiful idea in Gandhi. So you think about gifts. You think about a gift like a watch, a beautiful packet coming from online to you with nice wrapping paper, and that's a gift. And the idea of the gift is so beautiful. Now Gandhi says, Abhaidan, the gift of fearlessness. You gift all those who differ from you this whole confidence to be fearless from you. That's Abhaidan. So Gandhi, Raichand Bhai both made a connection between non-violence and Abhaidan. So it's only when you take the vow of being non-violent that others can get this gift from you. What gift? The gift of staying fearless. On his view, Gandhi's view, non-violence is the primary vow required to practice compassion. And according to Gandhi, a non-violent and a good human life involves all four concepts: non-violence, love, compassion, and gifting fearlessness to all human and non-human others. Please remember, for Gandhi, the non-human world is on exactly the same footing as the human world. Gandhi argues, for instance, that compassion towards the different other is directly involved in confronting her hostility by non-violent resistance rather than by violence. And such compassion is connected with Abhaydan. And he said, look, fearlessness, now he links it with fearlessness. And I'm going to sort of explain to you how you can philosophically reinterpret the connection Gandhi made between compassion and the gift of fearlessness if you think about what might be involved in cultivating the attitude of compassion towards all beings. And here there is now a third idea, that of being fearless yourself. Now, supposing you're full of fear, then you can't feel fearless from other people. You feel full of fear for them, and you can't empathetically identify with their pain. And that empathetic identification is required if you want to gift fearlessness to them. So Gandhi said, look, first rid your mind of fear, then gift others fearlessness. And that's the way that you can empathetically identify with them, through this feeling of compassion. And you can identify now with this thought if you look at what happens in the COVID-19 pandemic. People feel so fearful of infected people that they stop feeling compassionate towards them. They can't identify with them anymore, and thereby they cannot gift fearlessness to them. So you can only feel compassionate if you are fearless and if you gift fearlessness to others. Once one is fearless and full of compassion, one can also make hostile others feel fearless towards oneself. And Gandhi therefore spoke of ahimsa uh, as the largest love and the greatest charity. And I'm going to quote him over here. In its positive form, ahimsa means the largest love, the greatest charity. Gift of life is the greatest of all gifts. A man who gives it in reality disarms all hostility. He has paved the way to an honorable understanding, and none who is himself subject to fear can bestow that gift. He must therefore be himself fearless. Now, this cultivating fearlessness is a very important discipline today, where we are full of fear ourselves. And therefore, we cannot educate ourselves into feeling compassion, into thinking those three thoughts: their suffering is undeserved, they are suffering, and that we are also vulnerable in the same. Fear stops us from educating ourselves into feeling that kind of compassion. Now, Gandhi also seems to have connected this fearlessness with two other thoughts, that is, the ability to forget and to forgive. So, this also becomes a part of Gandhian ahimsa. Gandhi spoke of the need to inculcate both abilities as part of developing an ahimsana disposition of character. Seems fairly easy to understand why Gandhi should have connected the ability to forgive with ahimsa. For it seems apparent enough that if one is not able to forgive other people for what one thinks are injuries to oneself, there can be no feeling of non-violence, much less love, kinship for the erring other. Yet Gandhi thought that even the memory of past injuries to oneself or one's own group needed to be forgotten before one could feel that the other was like one's own. In this connection, it's important to note that in Hind Swaraj, Gandhi had emphasized the importance of forgetting. And here, there's this interesting connection that Gandhi makes he makes a difference between history and itihas. He says history, the modern discipline of history, is the discipline to keep the past feuds alive as dates, as records, and this doesn't allow you to forget past feuds. Whereas itihas, it so happened, is really, a way in which you can remember the past in terms of all the little events, all the small things that happened, and this might take you closer to forgetting feuds than history ever can. And so he says a nation which has no history is really a happy nation, is really a blessed nation. So Gandhi makes a close connection between ahimsa and this ability to forget. And he also, of course, talks about this ability to forgive. You can only forget, truly forgive, if you forget. If you keep remembering that this community hurt me, or this kind of, war we had between two nations, then you can never really forget, and therefore you can never forgive. And Gandhi said ahimsa is both forgetting and forgiving. If one is truly able to forgive another, no mark of the past injury can remain in one's memory. And this led Gandhi to rethink the meaning of history in chapter 17 of Hind Swaraj as itihas, or it so happened. And he says, look, history is something which provides you evidence about the doing of kings and emperors. It keeps past feuds vivid and alive by meticulously recording them. So there is a proverb that a nation which has no history, that is no wars, is a happy nation. And Gandhi suggested that one could think differently about the past and one's relationship to it as a people if the past was conceived as itihas, or it so happened. Now, so this is really, he wants to bring in the smaller narratives in itihas about how people quarreled, overcome quarrels, and began to live in peace. Um, the third, the next, notion that I want to bring in understanding ahimsa is the idea of humility. And here Gandhi says that if you want to invoke in yourself or develop in yourself an ahimsana disposition, you cannot do it till you learn to be humble. And I'm again quoting him, so long as man does not of his own free will put himself last among his fellow creatures, there is no salvation for him. Ahimsa is the farthest limit of humility. And this humility, or putting yourself, is really a minimizing of the ego in Gandhi. So Gandhi really thinks that you develop the virtue of humility, you start, reducing your ego. And humility is very, very important to Swarajya as self-rule, where the higher moral impulses in the individual begin to rule over the ego with all its passionate interests and egolessness. Without egolessness, you can't really move on the moral life for Gandhi. So, for Gandhi, individual freedom is a state of moral self rule, which basically means that individual egoistic impulses have lost the power to enslave the self, and humility becomes important to the discipline of becoming free from an over assertive sense of the self. And Gandhi himself makes this connection. For example, when explaining individual freedom in Hind Swaraj, he argues that to observe morality is to attain mastery over our mind and passion. So you think how, so ahimsa is basically, and again I'm quoting Gandhi, uttermost selflessness. Selflessness means complete freedom from a regard for one's body. Now you think how humility is important, because if there is a huge sense of the ego, and I'm remembering Iris Murdoch's argument here, that there is the big fat ego, and the ego wants to show you in the best light and therefore show everyone in the worst light. So you can't really ever arrive at the truth unless you reduce the sense of ego. So eventually humility as egolessness becomes part of ahimsa as the discipline to arrive at truth in a Gandhian framework of doing things. Now, it's interesting, just as an aside, that in his autobiography, Gandhi says that in 1928, Gurudas Banerjee had suggested that humility be added to the vows recommending for those who were living at Satyagraha Ashram. And Gandhi commented that though he was tempted to say, yes, we should take a vow of humility, he feared that humility's humility would be lost the moment it became a matter of taking a vow. So that's how much he thought about humility. So it's fairly clear that Gandhi's non-violence involves the cultivation of a moral disposition involving self-effacement, as well as the practice of compassion, fearlessness, the ability to forget, and love for differing others. And you also need to understand that you can't get at Gandhi and ahimsa, if you don't understand the connection between ahimsa and truth. And that is something which I think everyone is familiar with, because Gandhi talks about ahimsa and satya as two sides of the same coin. And I'm going to therefore go into my next section at the connection between ahimsa and satya. Now, Gandhi had often argued that to arrive at truth, it's necessary to meet opposing viewpoints and opposing people with ahimsa. He had emphasized that it's simply not possible to arrive at truth without humility, that is, without overcoming the obstructions caused by one's ego driven presuppositions. Consequently, the only path to truth in a Gandhian life is through negotiating the otherness of the other and what one sees as the truth untruths of others with humility and love, that is, with ahimsa. However, this does not mean that Gandhi recommended that when faced with hostility, one ought to give up the truth as one sees it. Rather, it means that the path to truth involves suffering in yourself, tapasya, for the sake of arriving at truth, as opposed to destroying what one sees as the truth untruths in the possession of others. It was in such a sense that Gandhi spoke of truth and non-violence as inseparably related. And Gandhi says, without ahimsa, it is not possible to find truth. Ahimsa and truth are so intertwined that it is practically impossible to disentangle and separate them. So, however, though ahimsa is the means and truth is the end of the good human life, they are so intertwined that the very being of ahimsa is the being of truth, because ahimsa, there is no means and distinction in Gandhi. Means are the ends. So as you practice ahimsa, you reach truth. And these two things are inseparably connected. And Gandhi says, look, if you practice ahimsa, step by step, you learn to make friends with the world and you realize the greatness of God or of truth. So this, connection can be better understood if we reflect on the idea that seeing things from within our own egocentric perspectives often prevents one from coming close to the truth. Often, predominantly ego-directed perceptions prevent one from seeing how things really are in the world, independent of how we may want to see them. One way in which one might be able to philosophically unpack the relationship between nonviolence and truth in Gandhi would be simply by reflecting upon the necessity of becoming free of the ego-driven self if one wants to arrive at truth. So this is really what ahimsa is. And for Gandhi, the path to moral religious truth can only be negotiated if one treats those who think differently from oneself about religious and moral truths as if they were our own kith and kin. Treating difference, taking difference seriously is important if we want to get at the truth of our own convictions. Because without ahimsa, one can't reach even the truth of one's own religious or moral beliefs. And so, responding with ahimsa to different others is internal to one's own search for truth. This last point is philosophically significant because this argument suggests that if one is to get at the truth at all, it is essential to treat the viewpoints of differing others with the same deference that one feels for one's own belief. This implies that one can make a case for treating the views of others with respect and deference without bringing in reasons that are extraneous, external to one's own search for truth. The history of liberalism is replete with arguments to support the recommendation to respect the views of others by reasons external to one's own search for truth. For instance, that one should defer to the views of others in the interest of creating a reasonably stable and just society, or that one should at least tolerate the views of opposing others in the interest of peace as a modus vivendi or truce. The Gandhian connection between truth and ahimsa constructs an argument where the route to treating the viewpoint of differing others with deference is internal to an individual's own search for the truth. You can't get at the truth without deferring to others. So that's really very, very important for Gandhi. Now, this really takes me to the last section of my talk where I'm trying to show why Gandhi is different from the liberals, why Gandhi's idea to defer to others, to honor those who differ from you is very different from the liberal idea of tolerance. right? Coexistence by tolerating, Shahishnuta. A question that could arise at this point would be to ask whether this Gandhian response to difference implies that Gandhi is really influenced by a liberal position. In other words, one can ask if Gandhi is a modern liberal. The operative word here is modern. And this is something I look at closely in my coming book with Springer on the Gandhi Ambedkar debate, where I really try to unpack how it's so difficult to call Gandhi a modern. Um, so one of the reasons why you can't call Gandhi a modern is that he doesn't recommend that you should tolerate differing and different others. He doesn't like this word tolerance. He says, look, I don't like the word tolerance. It looks like I'm superior and I'm tolerating other people. So, one can here think about liberal responses to, this whole issue of pluralism in the contemporary world, living with differing others, hostile religious others. Liberals have given you good philosophical reasons for arguing that you must tolerate those who have different religious beliefs from yourself. Such arguments have been extended both practically and conceptually to other sorts of differences between oneself and others who are different, who think about truth in opposing ways. So, the best reasons that liberals tell you, for instance, to tolerate others, come from people like Mill, for example. And all these arguments, Mill, Locke, and so on, they proceed from a position of skepticism about truth. And such skepticism makes liberals very limited when dealing with differences in the contemporary world, because many of the problems associated with pluralism only arise because people have faith in rather than uncertainty about their own beliefs. It appears apparent that liberal arguments that proceed from a position of uncertainty and skepticism about truth may simply not work for those who have faith in their own convictions about truth. They may not agree with Mill that, look, you've been mistaken in the past, you can be mistaken in the future, so kindly tolerate others who differ from you. This is not an argument that will make a sense to a devout religious person. He'll say, I have no skepticism about the truth of my beliefs. I think they're absolutely true. I don't think I can be mistaken. So this liberal argument is not going to work for him. So I'm just going to look, for instance, at Mill. Mill makes a meta-inductive argument for tolerance in his book on liberty. He recommends tolerance on the ground, like I said, that people know they can be wrong and that they are not infallible. And he says, look, even if people have an unshakable faith in the truth of their own convictions, they can still tolerate others who disagree with them because they recognize the value of diversity to the search for truth. However, this might not work, indeed it often does not work, for those who confront conflicting others in the contemporary world for a number of reasons. First, one should note that conflicts arise precisely because people believe and have absolute faith in the truth of their own convictions. Such faith often implies that the faithful are not open to thinking that it is because they might be mistaken that they should tolerate the opposing beliefs of those with whom they are in conflict. Secondly, such people certainly may not have a prior and overriding commitment to a comprehensive liberalism that values autonomy and diversity above the truths of their own moral, religious, and cultural convictions. Besides the fact that tolerance, proceeding from a skepticism about the possibility of arriving at truth, might not work in the contemporary world, there is also the possibility that liberal tolerance might not be enough. Tolerance may simply not be adequate when it comes to confronting contemporary pluralism, because the chief characteristic of such pluralism is that it is premised upon the absolute equality of the opposing viewpoints. While tolerance suggests that the one tolerating assumes a superior position, the absolute equality of opposing viewpoints suggests that each viewpoint commands respect rather than tolerance. It seems possible to argue then that in the contemporary world, one might need to respect rather than merely tolerate those who have beliefs different from oneself. And liberalism is just not giving you enough grounds to respect people who differ from you. Maximum thinking, being skeptical about truth, you can just tolerate all opposing viewpoints. And of course, you have to relegate them to the private space because liberalism has this big public-private divide. The liberal position on tolerance is also not really much strengthened if you look at arguments like Locke. Locke's argument for religious tolerance, for instance, talk about in the 1667 essay on toleration, Locke argues that religious beliefs are purely speculative opinions and therefore they are private in man's private space and that they have nothing to do with the public space and therefore they cannot necessarily produce any action which disturbs the community. So here a believer is tolerant to opposing religious others because religion is not only purely speculative, but it's a private affair. Consequently, religious belief is of no consequence to an individual's relations with other people in the public sphere. So, these arguments, whether we look at Locke or you look at Mill, they reiterate the liberal point that tolerance is an inevitable outcome of uncertainty and skepticism about the possibility of arriving at truth. The same arguments are extended by liberals to morality, ethnicity, culture, or indeed any set of truths that one might come to believe as true because of the accidents of time and place. Now, Gandhi's position is significantly different from that expressed by liberals like Mill and Locke. Why? For one, he's not speaking about toleration as a way of thinking about difference. On a quite different note, he thinks one should honor rather than tolerate all other ways of thinking about truth. Gandhi often suggests that one should think of the truths that others believe in as if they were one's own. In this context, one can gain insight about Gandhi's position by looking at some of the things he said about conflicting liberal, religious beliefs. And here I'm quoting Gandhi, one of the quotations which I really like. Sahishnutta is a translation of the English word tolerance. I did not like that word. Kaka Sahib too did not like that word. He suggested respect, for instance, for all religions. I didn't like that phrase either. Tolerance may imply a gratuitous assumption of the inferiority of other faiths to one's own, and respect suggests a sense of patronizing. Speaking in the context of religious pluralism, Gandhi had recommended that rather than speaking about tolerance or respect, one should express an equi-mindedness in learning to honor other religions as one's own. And he, like I said in the first section, he often used the metaphor of kinship, this family feeling. And, he wanted to treat everybody coming from different religions and, I'm using his words, as brothers and sisters. Again, bringing in this idea of kinship. So it's interesting that Gandhi is connected honoring those who differ from you with this kinship and to honor opposing others and conflicting beliefs as one would one's own implies an attitude of sameness, samata, acceptance of the status of absolute equality, of opposing beliefs and positions. And this is far more difficult to do than simply tolerating others who are different from you. This is the central point of difference between Gandhi's response to what appeared as the untruths of others and the tolerance recommended by liberals. To tolerate others could suggest the assumption of a superior position. In contrast, the Gandhian idea that one should treat the truths believed in by others like one would one's own implies the attitude of absolute equality while accepting absolute difference. A second way in which Gandhi differs from the liberals was in recommending that different others ought to be honored. One can argue that honoring others cannot come from a position of equal uncertainty or skepticism about all truth claims, but only from the conviction that all those who differ from each other are seeking absolute truth. Gandhi often spoke of truth as God, and he famously changed, I think it's in 1921, from God is truth to truth is God. So this is not skepticism about the possibility of arriving at truth. His recommendation to honor all viewpoints is not based on a liberal-like skepticism about truth claims. So this really has I started with the point that Gandhi's response to difference can be a powerful alternative to both liberal tolerance and non liberal conflict as alternative ways of responding to differing others in the contemporary world. The appeal of the Gandhian response as a third way of responding to difference arises from the fact that Gandhi's way could be acceptable to the faithful, to the devout, who believe in their own religious and moral cultural truths. This is because Gandhi does not base his arguments recommending deference to all opposing viewpoints on a skepticism about all truth claims. His position on plurality and diversity of truth claims proceeds from the standpoint of the faithful and the devout, rather than from that of the skeptic. His position can therefore appeal to the devout as providing good reasons for responding to difference with deference while having faith in your own truths. In a Gandhian framework, indeed, ahimsa is the only means to truth. Consequently, on this view, a believer's own progress towards truth cannot proceed without honoring and engaging with the views of those who differ seriously from yourself. So basically, in this lecture, I'm arguing that the contemporary relevance of the Gandhian legacy can be best located in Gandhi's conception of ahimsa, that Gandhi's conception of ahimsa is much more than non-injury. It involves compassion, gift of fearlessness, love, the ability to forget, the ability to forgive, humility. And the paper has argued that Gandhian ahimsa provides you with a conceptual resource for rethinking the way in which you respond to otherness in the contemporary world, which is really characterized by otherness, by plurality. So this presents an alternative to liberal tolerance and non-liberal conflict and basically as ways of negotiating with difference. One can then conclude this lecture with the thought that the Gandhian argument might provide us with the best reasons for honoring difference in the contemporary plural world in which we live. And I hope if I've been able to bring across how Gandhi moves beyond coexistence to deference and honor, that I've been able to contribute to this ongoing set of lectures about pluralism and about coexistence and peace, organized by the Indialogue Foundation. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And definitely, it was a very much related to coexistence and how we can relate it to the contemporary issues. And I was very fascinated by your lecture because how simply you define the concept of Gandhi in different category, defining into three different approaches, and it make it easier for a non-philosophy student to understand Gandhi in a much broader sense. So I have a couple of questions for you, but I don't know whether it's very much related. You talked about that how the love,
One,
how sorry.
hello. I'm sorry, I need to cut the phone. Good. Please continue.
It's okay. Actually, I just have some. I need few of the clarities. That is how you said in owning a kinship, we need to have this feeling of love, compassion, and this compassion will be suffering, undeserved, and vulnerable.
Yeah.
The how will you inculcate their values when we are tend to deal with the caste issue, especially in the contemporary? We have so many issues arising, that is caste issue, class issue, and very recently the Black Lives Matters issue which has emerged. So how will you see his ideas coexistence in these matters? Because I don't think the idea, and in the third part of your lecture you talk about the tolerance and plurality, which is very much different to from the Western notion of uh, tolerance and liberty which they have been practicing. So I just need a clarity what exactly the kind of tolerance Gandhi is approaching towards, especially if he has been existing in this contemporary in this era where we have so many issues. Like caste issue is still so prevalent, which was also prevalent at his time. And despite of that, I don't think he has been able to address the issue of caste very prominently in during the during independence pre-independence and during his era, and it is still a bigger issue. Why this idea of Gandhi is not been able to practicalize in the contemporary era, and how we exactly see this Gandhi's tolerance towards in what is exactly happening in the. I hope it. Yes.
Yeah. What I gather from your question is that you're saying that how would a Gandhian solution be proposed to the kind of schisms that we see in contemporary society along the lines
Exactly.
of, let's say, caste or culture,
Yes. Yes.
right?
Yes.
Just
Yes.
summarizing it. And whether this could at all be practical. Is that what
Exactly.
you're asking? Now,
Exactly.
the point is really one, I've often found people asking me whether Gandhi was practical. And
Hmm.
the one answer that I find that a really fascinating question, given that he was perhaps the most practical person this century has seen because he led, the 20th century has seen because he led the biggest mass movement, uh, huge mass movement. He must have been practical. And, he sort of led a non-violent freedom struggle, which was a hugely complicated freedom struggle. And if you recall that when there was all these riots in Naukhali and so on, he actually went and stayed in the Muslim quarter and had prayer meetings every single day. And he escaped without getting killed at that point. And eventually he was killed, not by by another religion votary, but by a religionist. So in that sense, I suppose his ahimsa, he proved by his own death how practical his ahimsa was, because it wasn't someone from another religion who killed him. So I would say certainly his movement worked, and therefore it must have been practical. And number two, I would say that what you see with, for instance, this black movements and the whole amount of difficulty, the schism in the society where liberalism has flourished for so many years. There is so much of pent up hatred over there. So that actually brings out the limitation of tolerance. The point is, where is toleration coming from? Toleration is not coming from having worked out your problems. Toleration is simply like you're saying, put your problems in the private space, and in the public space, you cannot really act except from liberal motives, right? So all the difficulties have not gone away. They are right there, unworked out in your private space. And they just come out when there is a crack. Now, what Gandhi was saying was, do not confine them to your private space, but work them out. So let's look at what he did about caste. I mean, a whole lot of people are very critical of Gandhi on the caste question. Because what did Gandhi do? He said, look here, I don't think untouchability is going to be removed only by making laws. He's going to be removed when the upper caste subject or self realizes that he's committed a terrible sin and that he must do tapasya and penance for what because he has to come to terms with the fact that here is this terrible sin in which he is implicated, and this brought him, this made both the upper caste against him as well as the depressed classes against him. So you find Ambedkar getting into a debate with him and saying, look, I don't want penance from the upper caste. I want the depressed classes to be the agents of the change. Why do you talk about the upper caste? Now the point is, why was Gandhi doing that? Because he understood that you can't get away from all this. You have to work it out. And if you do not work through the memories of the past, they will never really be worked out in society. So I think Gandhi was talking from within, non-modern notions of the self and non-modern notions of ordinary life. And therefore, in traditional worldviews, people were connected. And hence, you just couldn't walk away from the past. You had to work it out. And that's really, I think, what he was trying to do there. And rather than modernity showing that it's been able to work it out, I think the cracks really show you that, this whole public-private divide has not made those problems go away. They're still there. And the minute there is any crack, they come out boiling out from those cracks.
Yeah. So true. We have a couple of questions. I think we'll take from the chat.
I can see there are some comments on the chat.
Yes.
Uh,
Mm, There's a question from Professor Agarwal, and first of all, he'd like to thank you so much for the simple explanation of the great concept, the way that everyone understand. Since no one has a contract with the creator to come to this world as a human from X family, from Y gender, with Z color, from T nation, how come one can try to show that he is superior to the other? Humility is essential, and understanding the other is essential for the other to understand to understand you also.
Yeah,
I think this was.
this is a
Hmm.
comment, and that's a very wonderful and insightful comment, that without humility we'll never understand anyone else. Because I think Gandhi had great insights into this, that if you really are, if your ego becomes so, Iris Murdoch says the ego is dazzling. It
Yeah.
dazzles you. And because you have this project of keeping your ego going, you always have to see others as less. Otherwise, your ego can't be sustained. And therefore, if you want to understand anyone else's point of view or anyone else's truth, you really have to, work on this humility. So remember that Gandhi was not saying that you are going to do this all in one day. It was always a progressive thing. And so he used to like this Newman song, One Step Enough for me at a time. One step is enough. The
Yes.
night is long, and the road is dark and it's a long journey, but one step enough for me. So that's really how you have to think. If you think that all this, how are you going to ever do this? How are you going to become this perfect person? Gandhi was always that the moral life is lying in the progression towards. So obviously you can't get away with centuries of caste oppression, but you got to begin somewhere. And I think that's really what Gandhi was doing. He was trying to make people aware of the sin. So you see, just on the caste question, there I've also been working a lot on the Gandhi Tagore debate. And as a matter of fact, I wrote a book for Springer, which came out in 2015 end. And Tagore got very upset with Gandhi, because Gandhi once said that the Bihar earthquake is a divine chastisement for the sin of untouchability. And Tagore said, here there's this leader, trying to keep people in super. The point that Gandhi was making was, it's very important for people to come to realize the enormity of the sin that they have committed for centuries, if there is going to be working out of this terrible memory.
Yeah.
So Gandhi and Ambedkar had very different approaches. Ambedkar said that, look, the onus comes on the depressed classes to, kind of get to be liberal, modern subjects, the bearers of rights, and that this is really the way we are going to get away with oppression. But Gandhi said that should happen. But at the same time, those who are culpable in this sin should become conscious of their sin, and they should be able to atone for it through tapas and penance. And I think both these sides things are complementary. Law cannot, sort of wipe out things if people concerned do not realize all the mistakes that they've made. And so, in that sense, both their approaches complement each other.
Ah. So there is one more question from Lokendra Sharma, which is also related to the Gandhi's position on caste system. Now, Gandhi did put monumental efforts to abolish untouchability. However, at the same time, he did not walk the extra mile to work for the annihilation of the caste system. Now, when it came to truth, he did argue about respecting others. Why did he did not argue for overthrow of caste system, which at the first instance gave rise to organization of society on the basis of superiority and inferiority?
Certainly. So, one of this is the major, point on which Gandhi is severely critiqued by a large number of people, including Arundhati Roy. I think you must have seen her comment. And, there's a recent book by Colgate, OUP. I recommend it to everybody, where there is this historical analysis of 4 different stages, how Gandhi's attitude towards the caste system changed, and how that originally he was not recommending inter-caste marriages. Towards the end, he starts only attending marriages which are intercaste. So I think that Gandhi's views in this matter, they went progressively, and he gradually came to realize that the complete overthrow of caste and varna was required. In 1921, he spoke about overthrowing the caste system, and then he started speaking about an idealized system of varna, which was really no caste system, because in that idealized system of varna, you followed, the occupation for which you were best suited, and so on, which obviously, was very, very, so if you were a learned person, you became a Brahmin anyways.
Yeah.
So that was really not any system of varna. So I think Gandhi's views on this progressed, right? Now, there are 2 points here. One, that Gandhi is working, I mean, we are judging Gandhi retrospectively from the standpoint of today and not from the times in which he lived. And two, I think Gandhi had this idea, like I said, that you had to sort of reform your tradition, and that this was part of the vow of Swadeshi. That, you remember that he said that the list of yam niyams must include Swadeshi. So by this, you have a responsibility to your immediate neighborhood. That includes your immediate religious neighborhood, which is the religion of your forefathers. Now, according to Gandhi, you have a religious duty of reform. So you shouldn't really totally throw away the religion like Ambedkar did in 1927, burning the Manusmriti. Gandhi felt that instead of doing this, you really have a duty to reform. And therefore, you must engage. And that you must, from inside try to reform it. And therefore, you must work with people of all castes and make them realize the sin that they have done. You must open up the temples, and you must sort of reform your religious texts using reason to engage with them, and doing away with those parts of religious texts which are oppressive. So the difference between Gandhi and Ambedkar becomes, Ambedkar says, look, condemn all these texts completely, and Gandhi says, look, condemn those parts of them which are oppressive and try to reform the religion from within. Right? So this is, I think fundamentally a difference between Gandhi, who's writing from within, with a kind of critical discourse with tradition, and Ambedkar, who's completely taking a modern perspective and saying, we don't need this kind of religion, and just throw it away.
Yeah, true. Yeah. So I think we don't have any questions, but I do have one curiosity. It's not a question, but just a curiosity. Like you said that Gandhi's conception of ahimsa is of non-injury, compassion, love, out of fear. Is there any space for reason, rationality? I mean,
Yeah, I
in
mean,
the
actually, when he writes on the Gita, he says that, you have a religious duty to re-examine your religious beliefs in the light of reason. So he
yes,
says, look, now, when you read the Gita, you can't interpret yagna as offering oblations into the fire, but reason makes you reinterpret this idea of yagna in the times in which you live. And then it appears that yagna is nothing but service. And so, in our times, what he called Yug Dharma, for Indians struggling with colonialism, yagna came to mean bread labor and service of those most distant from your side. So he said, look, working with your hands for the well being of other people who are not connected with you in any immediate sense is true yagna. So, service in nation building is the new yagna. And he said, look, reinterpreting religious texts and reforming your religion in line with reason. He said there is no, any religious text which is against the insights of morality and reason cannot be accepted. This is what he writes. He writes about 1,000 pages and loads of interpretations on the Gita. And when he writes these commentaries, he says, look, you have a religious duty to interpret your religious texts. So you can't, for instance, go along with the same thing because that was suited to that time. And this reform is really what you need to engage in. So reason really does play a role, but not in the sense in which the Enlightenment says, for instance, that since the moral law comes from reason, as Kant says, Therefore, there is really very little room for religion. So if you're looking for an enlightenment perspective on religion from Gandhi, you're not going to find it, because Gandhi is not a modern in that sense. For Gandhi, remember, truth or God. He moved from God is truth to truth is God. So he's making space for God and religion, but he's also making space for critically interrogating your own religious tradition by using both moral as well as rational insights derived from the times in which you live. But he's not a thoroughgoing modern who is going to say with Kant that the moral law is really the dictate of reason, and therefore there is no room for religion. So that's really the way that you got to look at Gandhi, as someone who is in this critical discourse with tradition.
We have one more question by Lokendra Sharma. He said, abolishing untouchability is like treating the symptoms while keeping the root cause organization of society on the basis of superiority intact. Abolishing untouchability would be enough to respect the truth of Dalits.
No, so that's really the point that Gandhi was making all along. So he was saying that yes, you must abolish untouchability. And I think when it was finally legally abolished, everybody in the Constituent Assembly applauded Gandhi, because he was the first person to bring the question of untouchability into Indian politics. And this is something even which Baba Sahib himself admitted, that Gandhi was the first person to bring up this whole issue, right? But then Baba Sahib parted company with Gandhi, because Gandhi did not go the long distance which Dr. Ambedkar was going, right? 1927, Manusmriti is burnt, and Ambedkar says in the Annihilation of Caste that you must completely annihilate caste and do away with these texts. And Gandhi is saying you must engage with these texts, and yes, you must do away with caste, but we can keep some kind of idealized version of Varna and so on. So, but Gandhi is making the point all along that you need to look at this social problem, and you need to make all the sections of society work on this problem at the same time. So you can't really say we are going to do this by isolating, by saying, look, we'll find a solution in the political realm, we'll make laws, and we don't care what the upper castes are doing, right? He's saying the upper caste need to work at it too. And they have to understand that they've committed this terrible sin, and therefore they must do tapasya. They must, reform themselves. Because otherwise, you'll have a political solution and no social solution. So you got to make both these things go on together and in tandem for this problem to be rooted out. As long as the sinners don't recognize their sin, how are the sinned against going to get justice? They may get political justice, but they will not get social justice. And therefore, Gandhi said that the temple entry movement must go alongside the political and educational reforms. And so I think he had this whole idea that, that you need to work at the problem along all the dimensions. Whereas, you need to sort of reform the sinners along with, make space for political, legal, educational reform.
We do have a counter question by arguing that we don't need to discard the scripture which gives rise to caste system. Is he not in some way perpetuating and legitimating the dominant upper caste truth of that time?
Well, I would say it's difficult to say that Gandhi is legitimating the dominant upper caste truth, because he's quite clear that those portions of the sacred texts. Now, remember, these sacred texts are absolutely huge, and they deal with all kinds of things, from medicine to ritual to to caste system is one aspect. There's a whole lot of things going on over there, right? And you don't find the caste system everywhere. Every text is not about the caste system. And I think what Gandhi was trying to do was reject those portions of the sacred texts which were dealing with the caste system. And I think in Kolge's recent book with OUP, there is this whole analysis of Gandhi year by year, where he gradually moved to the position towards the 40s that that caste and varna must totally be overthrown, and that no text which is mentioning caste and varna can be accepted. But you find this happening progressively, and in the beginning, you find him trying to reform the tradition. So, you can't really, um, whereas Ambedkar in 1926 itself decided to convert and eventually converted in 1956, you find Gandhi taking the route of reform. And that, like I said, is because of Swadeshi. He thinks that you have an immediate commitment to your neighborhood. This includes your religious neighborhood, and that you can't sort of throw it away. So if you don't like your neighbors, you can't throw them away, but that you need to reform them, you need to engage with them. This is your religious duty. So I think he felt that Hindus had a religious duty to engage with their own tradition and purge it of its defects, and that if you totally discarded your ritual framework, somehow that it would affect your relationship with the past and the memories of that past. And that if as a in modernity, there is the idea, for instance, you find Charles Taylor looking at the makings of modern identity, where you see there is this whole idea, the Lockean moment of erasure, that you can do away with all the memories and all the ideas that you had and build anew on an empirical foundation. But in more traditional notions of the self, the past becomes relevant to your relationship with the past becomes relevant to who you are in the present. And I think for Gandhi, he was moving from this kind of a traditional worldview where that complete break with the past would, in a sense, erase who you are as a person and your sense of personal identity. So that continuity with the framework was in some moment important to Gandhi. And so he felt that you needed to deal with that past and that you needed to reform it rather than throw it away. And this, I think, is the problem in the debate between Gandhi and Ambedkar. Gandhi is trying to keep some kind of continuity with the past, whereas Ambedkar is completely rewriting history. So you find Ambedkar, for instance, becoming a Buddhist and then rewriting Buddhism, cleansing it of its metaphysical elements. This is a very much a modern enterprise. And Gandhi is engaging in a kind of dialogue with critical dialogue with tradition. So I know, I mean, it's not like I'm defending him, but it's just like I'm making sense of him, which are two very different things to do. Philosophers don't need to defend anybody. They just make sense and make a clearing in a Heideggerian sense. You make a clearing where everything becomes visible. That's it. This is really what he was doing.
The idea of design. There's two questions from Alia Khan Fatimi. She asked, how has Gandhi's thought on white supremacy in South Africa evolved to incorporate the idea you shed light on today? And her second question is, how are Gandhi's incorporation of the oppressed classes into the social system as Harijans sit with how Gandhi is revered and remembered today? Doesn't it prolong the marginalized suffering?
Okay, the first question, yes, Gandhi, when he started out in South Africa, and I think Ram Gua has, very diligently argued this and brought out the point that right in the beginning, certainly, many of his statements kind of bring out the point that he did not consider the problem of the blacks in the manner that he considered the problems of Indians in South Africa. And he did definitely try to, he had this idea that Indians were British subjects in South Africa, and that therefore they were entitled to the same respect which anybody who's a British subject is entitled to. And that led him to not, consider the problems of the indigenous black population in the manner in which he posited and dealt with the problems of the Indian settlers, whom he wanted to show as British subjects. And later on, when he realized, the kind of suffering that the indigenous population was undergoing, then you find him becoming sympathetic and, changing his stance. For instance, when he worked in the rebellions, he, worked in the ambulance corps. And at that point, he wrote, long statements in his collected works about how he understood, I mean, how he personally took care of the natives who were injured. So certainly you find a shift over there. And later on, you find that people like Mandela and Martin Luther King drew a whole lot of inspiration from Gandhian ideas of satyagraha during the and across the black movement, right? So he certainly becomes a resource in that sense. Now, moving on to the second question, the difficulties, the let's say Harijan versus Dalit, right? The terms Harijan, children of God, right? Now, yeah. So, is it a is why should, I mean, certainly, does this prolong suffering? I think for Gandhi, for instance, he says God is truth and truth is God. So for him to speak about children of God is really speaking about uh, children of truth, and everything is truth for him. So I don't think he meant it in any kind of derogatory fashion. And of course, if we look at it retrospectively from the standpoint of today, we may say that why did he choose Harijan rather than the term Dalit, downtrodden, literally oppressed, right? I think since he thought truth is God and God is truth, he wanted to sort of bring out the, let's say, the truth, or he wanted to bring out the fact of oppression. He wanted to put that out in the open space. And remember that he toured all over the country in these anti-untouchability tours. And the first attempt in his life was actually made during an anti-untouchability tour in Pune. And lots of the politics of Gandhi's assassination came from the fact that he tried to bring the oppressed into the center, people from the margins into the center of Indian politics. So I think when people critique Gandhi on the Dalit question, they forget that Gandhi's, Ashish Nandi, for instance, makes the point how Gandhi's own, the politics of Gandhi's assassination had a lot to do with the fact that he was bringing people from the margins into the center of Indian politics. And Gandhi is really the first person to make untouchability a concern of Indian politics. So we forget that because he couldn't run as fast as we can today, we sort of critique him retrospectively. And I wonder how this retrospective engagement with the past is really true to the past. So, the same thing happens with feminists who look at Gandhi and say that, oh, he did not got far enough in the women's movement. And modern feminists who look at Kant and say, Kant is really looking from male paradigms when he talks about reason. So, in the sense that you forget that it was Kant who made space for the modern feminist movement. There would be no modern feminist movement if Kant had not, defined liberal paradigms in the way that he did. So in the same way, there could have perhaps been, Baba Sahib Ambedkar would not have been able to make the kind of contribution he did if Gandhi had not cleared the space in the manner that he did. So the fact that Gandhi could not run that fast doesn't mean that he was not committed. So here I think you find two good men opposed to each other and not able to reconcile with each other, because one is kind of still arguing from an old world Indian mind, as K.C. Bhattacharya said, and one who is a modern and who is able to dispense with all this because he thinks, look, religion is something different. Religion is not about God. It's about liberty, fraternity, and equality. And Gandhi thinks that religion is about God and spirituality, and therefore he can't dispense with all the religious texts in the way in which Baba Sahib is able to do. And I also think Baba Sahib Ambedkar is also tied to the past in very beautiful ways. For instance, the history of untouchability is dedicated to some of the untouchable, the depressed classes saints. For instance, he dedicates it, to Ravidas and Chokhamela. And, he talks, I don't know if you know, Ravidas writes this beautiful poem, Begumpura. And Baba Sahib Ambedkar in that book talks about recovering the origin of untouchability in the lost city of the past. And there he reinvents a proud Buddhist past for the depressed classes while speaking about the city of the past. And Ravidas, to whom he dedicates this book, has written this poem Begumpura about the city where everybody will be free. So in that move, I feel Baba Sahib then connects himself with Ravidas while inventing this proud Buddhist past and laying the foundation for this future city, this future India of equality, liberty, and fraternity. So I don't think he was that disconnected with the past as he's made out to be.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was a wonderful lecture, and I guess there are a couple of more questions, but we are short of time now. In case anyone wants to have more discussion with Professor Puri, they can go to the Twitter at Professor Puri, and this lecture is sorry.
At the rate Professor Puri.
At the rate Professor Puri, they can go to the Twitter at the rate Professor Puri and ask their question or anything they feel like need a clarification for anything. And I want to conclude by saying that this lecture was very simple. It explained everything very simplistically, and it was thought provoking. And this lecture is actually recorded, and it will be available on In Dialogue Foundations, which is on the YouTube channel. So I request all of you to subscribe this channel, and in case if you need any sort of clarification or you missed any point, you can go at our channel at In Dialogue Foundation on the YouTube. And besides, I thank you all for the participation and being patient with us for this discussion. And a very grateful thanks to Professor Puri for giving us such an insight. And I also request all the participants to be the part of this lecture series next week as well. And we are looking forward for a more insightful lectures in the futures as we has this lecture today. Thank you so much, ma'am, for being a part of In Dialogue Foundation, and thank you everyone for this lecture.